A couple weeks ago, I went to go to the movie theaters and I saw this movie titled Risen. And if you haven't seen it yet, I do highly recommend seeing it. Even though there are some biblical inaccuracies according to the Brit Hadashah, aka the New Testament. And so we'll go to some of these scriptures and compare it to some of the inaccuracies in the movie, but there are some good accuracies as well. Portraying the truth that is exposed in what is taught in this book. And although there are reviews out there with the Rolling Stone and the Washington Post, as well as some YouTube videos you can probably find as well, just by searching for it, and you'll find some movie reviews on this movie titled Risen. And a friend of mine requested after the movie, and we were discussing, he said, you should do your own movie review and post that on YouTube. So here I go. And his name is Matisyahu. Thank you out there if you're listening to this review of mine. And as I titled it, a movie Jew review, a little different than what you'll find in some of the other reviews, because I'm going to go from the accuracy and we'll go to the Tanakh, the Old Testament, and do some comparisons as well. But this movie, first of all, in case you haven't seen it, I'll just give you a quick summary that it begins with the crucifixion, as you probably already know, and I recommend watching some of the video, the trailers on it. And you can see that as well in the trailers. But the movie is mostly based on a post-crucifixion story about a Roman, a high-ranking Roman, also known as tribune, is the word for like a champion soldier or a very high-ranking Roman soldier. But in the movie named Clavius. And he's played by the actor Joseph Fiennes, or however you pronounce his last name. Pilate was played by the actor of the name of Peter Firth. And Yeshua, aka Jesus, is played by the actor Cliff Curtis, who also is the actor who plays in that zombie thriller that's on TV called Zombies or something to that, from what I don't watch it, but that's what I heard in some of the other reviews. But as you may not know, or you do know, Clavius is given this task by Pilate in the movie to prove that Yeshua's crucifixion is authentic, that he truly did die, and that he died on that cross, which he does in the movie in the beginning. And also with a task to make sure that nobody steals that body, as they were warned. And so Pilate tells them to seal that tomb so that if that stone does roll away, they're going to know with perfect evidence that cannot be doubted. So he seals it Roman style. And he was appointed to actually another task he had was to appoint faithful guards to watch the stone, guard it with their life, to make sure that none of the disciples or anybody would roll away that stone and steal the body and claim that he was resurrected as some kind of a phony resurrection, is what they feared. And then once the body is gone, and his task was to search and find that body to prove the true death of this Yeshua from Nazareth, aka Jesus, as we say in his modern name. That's most popular today in recent centuries, especially since over the last 500 years. If you just dig out the Old King James Version, first edition, as well as William Tyndale's version, you'll see it wasn't spelled Jesus with a J. It was like I-E-S-U-S, pronounced something like Iusis. But the letter J wasn't pronounced like that back then. So this name that was converted to the Greek, to the Latin, and now into English is quite different. If we were to take the name Yeshua, Yah is like a poetic short version of the Yah, we say hallelujah, praising God in a lot of songs and prayers and liturgy. But in both Judaism and Christianity, that's an accepted name or a poetic title or a short version. Like some people call me Russ, and my full first name is Russell or Russell. But here in the movie, we see that the guards were to guard him, and that they didn't do their job. We'll get to that a little bit more a little later in this video teaching. But first of all, I just want to say I'm impressed with some of the accuracies of this movie before I get to some of the inaccuracies that I'm a little bit disappointed in. But the usual Hollywood usually comes up with even more inaccuracies, and so I thought overall it's an improvement coming from Hollywood trying to do a Bible story. But as you look at the trailers, it looks like this movie is going to be really violent, kind of like Passion of the Christ that came out, Mel Gibson's movie, which is really bloody, really gruesome, and deaths and murder and mayhem and so forth. But this movie wasn't as violent or bad as I was expecting it. After I did watch the reviews, the trailers, I should say, beforehand, and so it's PG-13, but I see that there's other children there that are much younger than 13, and even my own daughter, who's 7 years old, probably wouldn't, doesn't find it too violent. But it's good to see the realities of a Roman-style crucifixion for a reality check, and help you also appreciate the peaceful times that we have, especially if you're here in the United States, and the freedom that we have today. But it's also good to kind of get a wake-up call and a reminder or a reality check on the Jewish versus the Romans, the diverse first century cultures, religious beliefs, and the prejudices and the hatreds of the religious differences as well, which also affected Christianity in later centuries. So I think from that perspective, it's good to kind of see those roots and those origins that are coming forth from the first century. That shouldn't surprise us if we see some pretty big changes in religious beliefs over centuries. But I thought that it portrayed some of that pretty well. The clothing and the film footage was good quality. It was a very professionally done movie, not just a low-budget type movie that usually a lot of these Bible stories are done on. And this was very well invested and with high-tech and special effects, and done very well for a Hollywood-style professional movie. And I like how they use the name Yahshua, or we say Yeshua. Some might say Yehoshua. Basically, it means that God, however you use the first Shua, God is salvation. Shua is the Hebrew word for salvation. And if you, like I said earlier, if you translate that, transliterate it, or translate it into an English-sounding word, it would be Joshua, not Iusis or Jesus. If we were to properly translate it, and it is translated into English as most people say Joshua today, but the meaning in Hebrew has so much more meaning in it than any other language that it converts or changes into. And hopefully, what I'm hoping is that when you see that, and you see the accuracy of his name, that both Christians and religious Jewish people out there in Judaism will see it if they watch it and see, wow, that was his name. I wonder what other areas we've been misinformed about. Yes, he was a Jew from Nazareth and had a Jewish, a Hebrew name, not a Greek or a Latin or English name that sounds more like a pagan Greek god. And he didn't have super long hair, and that was one thing I would say that's also good about this movie. It didn't portray him as a super hippie hair, long-haired, blonde-haired beautiful or feminine looking type Messiah, as often you see portrayed by a lot of Christian movies and stories and pictures of the past. The actor did look a lot more Jewish than Gentile in that movie. And although his hair's still a little bit long, not as short as, I'm sure in those days it wasn't as short as maybe mine is on top right now. And Hebrews tend to have longer beards back then. And we see in Isaiah, in 52, that there's an indication that his beard would be pulled and plucked before suffering and dying, as it says in Isaiah 53, that he will suffer. And it also says that there's no beauty that we would look upon him. He wouldn't just stand out in a crowd, in other words, or in a picture. I mean, Judas had to kiss him to betray him because he looked like the common Jew. And if we want to perhaps be a little bit more biblically accurate, we would do that a little more accurately. We see that King David was... well, before I get to some of the inaccuracies, let me finish the accuracies here. Like I said, Yeshua is a good name. It's a Hebrew name. Clavius, or Tribune, he's also referred to as in the movie, the high-ranking Roman soldier, like a champion soldier. His greatest fear, what was probably most profound in this movie to me, was that he confessed his greatest fear to Yeshua, and that is that his greatest fear was being wrong. Now, could that be some of our greatest fear, whether we're in Judaism or Christianity today, is that maybe we were taught something wrong? Well, that could be a greatest fear, one of the greatest fears. I think another greatest fear is what other people are going to think of us for actually believing in the truth. Sometimes the greatest fear is what our loved ones and other people, friends and family and others, will think of us if it sounds strange or different from what's commonly accepted by those we love and care about, who we esteem as having high credibility. So I thought that was interesting, that confession he made, his greatest fear. Now, to getting to the biblical inaccuracies, I should say, inaccuracies. I just covered some of the accuracies. And this is based upon my memory. I didn't take down notes. I should have brought a clipboard and note paper and took down notes. But this is mostly based on my memory. So if I am wrong in any way, I'll go back. Please point it out. You can make a comment on this video teaching. You could contact me personally with a personal email off my website, TorahTruthSeekers.org. You can just Google search Torah Truth Seekers and put whether you have the org or not. Hopefully it'll come up as one of the high choices there in your search engine. But anyway, based upon my memory, well, in the movie, these soldiers that are watching this tomb with the stone there and the big seals, it shows them getting drunk, and just two of them just being kind of drunkards. And there's no evidence, if there is, in the scriptures here of the Brit Hadashah, the New Testament. Please point it out to me. But from what I found, the only Matisyahu would be his first century name, his Jewish name. And in case you didn't know, all the authors of the Brit Hadashah, the New Testament, are Jewish. They were Jewish. Even Luke. If you think Luke was a Gentile, well, email me. I'll give you plenty of evidence to show he was a Jew also. And most likely, and it can be ambiguous, so if people want to disagree, that's fine. But anyway, in Matisyahu chapter 28, I'll read here and tell me if you can see that these guards were drunk. I think the Roman soldiers, a high-ranking one, with a threat of the body being stolen and a Messiah resurrecting from the dead as he prophesied, I think they would choose some of the best soldiers available and I don't think they would just be getting drunk, unless there's some evidence to show it. Again, let's look at the account here. And if you don't believe that he's the Messiah, please don't get offended. Please continue listening here to this. It says here in chapter 28, verses 1 through 4, now after the Sabbath, we say Shabbat in Hebrew, in the Sephardic, common Israeli term today, in Israel as well, would be Shabbat for Sabbath. As the first day began to dawn, so the dawn there, even in the Greek, shows that the sun was rising on the first day of the week. And that would have to be on a Sunday morning, of course. So Mary Magdalene and the other Mary came to see the tomb. And other accounts say they were bringing spices to finish embalming his body. But in verse 2 here it says, and behold, there was a great earthquake. For an angel of the Lord ascended from heaven and came down and rolled back the stone from the door and sat on the stone. He sat on the stone is what it says here. And it was something to that effect in the movie so far. His countenance was like lightning, and his clothing was white as snow. And white, you see white garments in the scriptures referring to righteousness. This is a good angel, obviously, is the implication and the metaphoric understanding that comes from this. In verse 4 it says, and the guards shook for fear of them and became like dead men, is what it says in the King James, New King James Version. In other words, they were like frozen stiff. They were so in shock. They probably just froze like statues, looked as if they were dead, as a statue or a dead person doesn't move. Could be a kind of a metaphoric idiom here, that they were like dead men, like they weren't dead men. It says they were like, and then the angel talks to the women and so forth here. So again, it doesn't say anything about them being drunk, and the other accounts don't cover the guards like this, or even talk about them being drunk either. From what I know, like I said, prove me wrong. Give me some scriptures if I'm wrong. So that was one I thought was whoever was making that movie was reading a little bit too much into it and trying to maybe he's trying to plead both sides who are believers and unbelievers, showing that it could have been a fake, could have been this, and I don't know what their reasons are for making them drunk, but if there are some evidence, I don't know. Please, like I said, bring it to my table here. Let me see. Now notice this. The second inaccuracy I noticed was that, first of all, it was Peter's idea to go fishing after the resurrection. And I think in the movie, if I remember right, I think Yeshua says, go to the Sea of Galilee. And I think he's told, if I remember right, that's what my memory tells me. And before he said, stay in Jerusalem. The disciples at one point are told to stay in Jerusalem, don't leave. They want him to stay there until Shavuot, or we say Pentecost in Greek, the 50th day of counting the Omer. And so they were to stay in Jerusalem, but they were told this. What I'll propose and show you with the scriptures is they were told after they went fishing, when they finally were with Yeshua for 40 days after the resurrection. He tells them to stay in Jerusalem. So notice this. We'll go to the book of Acts chapter 1, and we'll see this a little bit more clearly. Oh, before I do, no, it's John, or we'd say Yochanan. His first century name was Yochanan, or we say John today. 21, John chapter 21, and I'm going to read verses 1 through 4 here. And it says, after these things, Yahshua showed himself again to the disciples at the Sea of, and it says Tiberias here in the King James, also known as Galilee. And in this way he showed himself, Simon Peter Thomas, called Didymus, and then it goes through some of the names of the disciples here. Verse 3, and Simon Peter said to them, I am going fishing. And so it doesn't say he's all discouraged and that he's going fishing, but maybe they were just hungry and they were discouraged after the resurrection. They see him for a little bit, according to the other accounts, but apparently they get either they get discouraged or they just go fishing in Galilee and before they start doing whatever they were planning to do next. But it just says, Peter says, I'm going fishing. He wasn't told to go fishing, or they weren't told to go to Galilee, but he goes there and he encourages the others to go fishing with him. And of course, all night long they don't catch anything. And I think it's interesting when Yeshua sees them, he says, children. Wouldn't that be strange for grown men to be called children? But that's what it says here, children. Have you any food? And they answered no. And that's where he says, to cast the net on the other side of the boat. And the rest of the story is portrayed there in the movie. Now, to see that it also wasn't after the Messiah, Yeshua, was with his disciples, let's go right to Acts chapter 1, verse 4 here. In Acts chapter 1, verse 4, it says, and being assembled together with them, this is referring to Yeshua, after the resurrection, he commanded them not to depart from Jerusalem, but to wait for the promise of the Father, which he said, you have heard from me. So here he commands them to not to depart from Jerusalem. And so when we put these accounts together, it doesn't look like they go to Galilee after he commands them there. We'll have to go to, in fact, if we go to Acts chapter 1, verses 9 through 12, we'll see a little bit more. The third inaccuracy I see is that in reality, Yeshua departed and he ascended. Remember in the movie at the end, they're out in the wilderness somewhere. It doesn't say where they're at. It's after they're done fishing. He spends some time with them, and then he ascends up into heaven. But according to the scriptural account, he was at the Mount of Olives when he ascended. And he said, well, let's go there and read Acts. If you're in chapter 1 already, let's go to verses 9 through 12. It says, now when he had spoken these things, while they watched, he was taken up. So notice the earlier verses 4, he commands them to stay in Jerusalem. And then he goes up from the Mount of Olives here. So they didn't have time to go. This is the last time they see him. So they couldn't have gone to Galilee afterwards, and do the fishing and have Yeshua come again. Because notice this, it says, now when he had spoken these things while they watched, he was taken up, and a cloud received him out of their sight. And while they looked steadfastly toward heaven as he went up, behold, two men stood by them in white apparel. Now, these could have been angels, because we see also in the Tanakh, the Old Testament, that angels sometimes come and look like men for a mission, or just sending a message, like Gabriel. We see him as a messenger. So notice this in verse 11, and this is what these two men say. Men of Galilee, why do you stand gazing up into heaven? This is the same Yeshua who was taken up from you into heaven. It's the same one that was with him for 3.5 years, or however long his ministry was, and for 40 days after the resurrection. It's the same one. Will also come in like manner as you saw him go into heaven. So notice, they see him go. He says he's going to come. When he does come back, he's going to come back in like manner. He's not going to come as some man on the seashore of Galilee. He says the next time you see him, he's going to come back. And we'll see that this is on the Mount of Olives. if you go to verse 12, it says, "Then they returned to Jerusalem from the Mount of Olives." Very clearly, they're at the Mount of Olives here, which is near Jerusalem, a Sabbath day's journey. Now, notice in, let's go back to Daniel. We'll see him coming in the clouds, and his feet will set on the Mount of Olives. So this is perfectly compliant with the prophets, with the Tanakh here. So I'll go to two places just to prove this real quickly. Daniel chapter 7, verses 13 and 14. If you'll go there in verses 13, here's Daniel's quoting here. "And I was watching in the night visions, and behold, one like the Son of Man." Like the Son of Man. And even the sages in Judaism know that this is referring to the Moshiach, the Messiah, is also referred to as the Son of Man. And we see this in the gospel accounts. Also, Yeshua referred to himself as the Son of Man. And notice this. "Coming with the clouds of heaven, he came to the Ancient of Days." Now notice that Yeshua is not the Ancient of Days. You know, we could say the Father, the Creator. He says, "He came to the Ancient of Days, and they brought him near before him." Verse 14, "Then to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom." Wow, it was given to him. "That all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion." Now, for those of you who out there who know your Hebrew, and you go to this section and look at the Hebrew, so we could see this Son of Man is divine. He is worthy of worship. And he carries the name with him, that authority and rank of the Ancient of Days, "which shall not pass away, and his kingdom the one which shall not be destroyed." It will never be destroyed. So this is where he says, or the two men says in the book of Acts, that when he comes back, he'll come back as he left on the Mount of Olives, and this is what will happen. And we'll see this also spoken of very quickly and briefly in Zechariah. Zechariah chapter 14 and verse 4 here, and it says, "And in that day his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives, which faces Jerusalem on the east, and the Mount of Olives shall be split in two." Some kind of a huge earthquake. It hasn't happened yet. This is futuristic still. "From east to west, making a very large valley." And it continues here. So we see that he will come back in the clouds. He was ascended up into the clouds, and then his second coming will come back. And even in Judaism, in the Talmud, they speak of Moshiach ben Joseph, we say Yosef, and Moshiach ben David, the suffering servant, coming as a man, suffering, and the second one, the kingship. They know that on that day, that Feast of Trumpets they call Rosh Hashanah, Yom Teruah, he will come in the clouds. And that will be, as we can see, his second coming, according to the Brit Hadashah, and as we can see even prophesied throughout the Tanakh, of the two Messiahs, but one Messiah, as the sages say. So that's important to know. It wasn't just out in the wilderness anywhere that he ascends, and he's not going to come back as a man, his next coming, or just in spirit only. He's going to come as the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, and it'll be one world government, but his government, not a man-made counterfeit or attempt to be like him that's not like him. It will be him and his faithful saints, his servants, his first fruits. Those are the first resurrection, as we see in the scriptures as well. So the fourth inaccuracy I noted, or in my memory banks anyways, I didn't take notes at the time, was that Yeshua, aka Jesus, was not wearing any tzitzits in this movie risen. In some of the other movies that have been made on him, like I think Jesus of Nazareth, I think he's wearing tzitzits in that one, and his talit, or his outer garment. But we see, for example, in the Brit Hadashah, we see everywhere he went, he not only wore tzitzits, or tassels, as we say in English. And sometimes it'll say hems or borders or corners. But the Catholic and the Protestant translators have not wanted to translate it as that. But notice this. In Mark chapter 6, you go to the very last verse in Mark chapter 6, it says, wherever he entered, into the villages, the cities, or the country, they laid the sick in the marketplaces and begged him that they might just touch, it says, the hem of his garment. It should say the tassel of his garment, the tzitzit. Even in the Greek, you look that up in the Strong's Concordance or any concordance, you'll see that the root word goes back. Same wording that's used for tassels and tzitzits in the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament, the Tanakh. And so it's important to see that he wore them. So any movie that's going to have him in it, and it's going to show his clothing on it, it should be showing tzitzits with the blue thread. There's a techelet. Not just any blue, but techelet is like a sky blue, kind of a lightish color blue. As we see, I think it's kahal, is blue, but techelet is a shade of blue, a lighter, like a royal blue, or maybe a turquoise. Even the rabbis can't say for sure. The understanding is that it came from a certain snail, and maybe they even got it from octopuses in the Mediterranean during those ancient times. But it's very powerful dyes that don't just come out when you wash your clothes in the regular washer. It's very strong dyes that they had back then. And you can get some today now if you order it from Israel. There is a market now, and those snails are growing over there dramatically since 1948. Another thumbs up there for that. But Yeshua he was wearing them everywhere he went. And so that's just a fourth, maybe, inaccuracy. And I think it's important because, as it says, anyone who touched him were healed. So there's some very important symbolic meaning to it. If it's just something abolished, why would everyone be healed who touched it? And there's some important meanings in there that I think have been lost in Christianity, and probably because they didn't want to be too Jewish. But it's, when you look at the scriptures in the Old Testament, even in Zechariah, it says in the Messianic kingdom that the faithful ones will be wearing, those who know the Creator will be wearing tzitzits. And I have a video teaching on that on YouTube if you're interested in seeing that and you're unfamiliar with that. As well as there's commandments in the books of Moses to wear them, to be holy, to be different, to be set apart. Who in the world wants to wear tassels with blue thread on it? Only those who really want to follow the scriptures. Everyone else thinks it's weird and crazy, or silly, or cultish, or just too Jewish. But it's actually biblical, and what the Creator loves and promotes. He doesn't demote or downplay it at all in the Brit Hadashah in the New Testament. So I, wonder by these inaccuracies about whoever's behind writing this movie. I mean, are they really reading their Bibles? Do they really want everything to match up to it? Do they really believe in the New Testament? Or is it some kind of agenda? I don't know. To create, kind of like the Da Vinci Code. You have all these true historical facts that are in that story, but then even Da Vinci said this is a made-up story. He's making things up to add to true effects and true history. But some people just want to accept the whole thing as truth. And if you do that with this movie and you read your Bible, well, eventually you're going to start thinking, I don't know what is true. I don't know what's accurate. Is it all just a bunch of fables? Jewish or Greek fables and stories? What can I believe? And maybe it could, hopefully it won't cause any doubts or People think it's just man-made, fabricated, fictitious stories or fairy tales. But the scriptures, I believe, are actually true. And if you want to believe that these are true, and then that's great. And the movie is probably I still recommend it as a good movie to watch. And even though there are some errors, and we might wonder, why would they want to portray errors? Why doesn't Hollywood ever just, when they do a Bible story, why don't they just read it, get to know it, or hire someone who does to help them take out any inaccuracies before they actually go public with it? But if you have a strong faith in Yeshua and the Brit Hadashah and the Tanakh, the whole Bible is one holy book, then I doubt this movie will shake your faith. I think the accuracies in it are also overweighing the inaccuracies, and that this movie won't affect you in a negative way. And I personally can easily overlook inaccuracies, because I personally like to see footage, any kind of footage of the Holy Land, of Israel and the first century Middle Eastern cultures and the clothing that they wore back then, and to see the Messiah looking more like a Jew, as he was a Jew from Nazareth. And that Jew, whether you believe it or not, he died for you and all of us here. And he wasn't, rather than just believing in, he wasn't just some long-haired hippie-looking or super feminine or outstandingly handsome in appearance, as we can see in the scriptures. And also, to be a little more accurate, like I was starting to allude to earlier, is we see King David had reddish hair. And he had bright colored eyes, like a blue or green, just bright colored. And so far in these movies of Jesus or Yeshua, never see him like that. Of course, the Bible doesn't say, and it's ambiguous, we should admit, but King David had reddish hair and bright eyes, and so did Joseph. Before him, his tomb has been found in Egypt with the Semitics that were slaves in Israel 200 years, about 200 more years before Ramses. If you're looking in the Ramses time period, you're not going to find the Semitic people. And this is where the archaeologists have either purposely or ignorantly assumed the wrong timing. But you go back, dig 200 years earlier, you find the Semites, the Hebrews there living, and then you find this second in command of Egypt, who doesn't look Egyptian. He's got reddish hair and a red beard, and according to the painting that's in his tomb, the body's not there, and the scriptures say his bones were taken back to the land of his fathers, Abraham, and so his body's not there, but this tomb of someone who's second in command under Pharaoh, who wasn't Egyptian or dark-skinned looking, but light-skinned, and he had reddish hair, according to the tomb that has been found with the Semitic people in Egypt. And if you want evidence of that, email it to me. There's a great documentary and more than one out there to show that's come out in recent years here. Another thing I liked seeing about the movie is just to see evil people repent. They're being converted and transformed, like Clavius, this Roman soldier, through miracles and signs and wonders that we just don't see today. And that gets people to question, why don't we see these today, as we see in the book of Acts? I mean, there are happenings here and there, and if you'll come across people who you can trust and believe can have miraculous healings or visions of Messiah. We have, stories are coming out all over, but not nearly as much, I think, as we see in the scriptures. And it does say in Mark, in the book of Mark chapter 16 and 17, verses 17 and 18, it says, and these signs will follow those who believe, those who really believe. He says, in my name, this is Yeshua speaking here, in my name they will cast out demons, they will speak with new tongues or languages, and they will take up, and if they take up serpents, or if they drink anything deadly, and it's talking about venomous serpents, I'm sure here, and by no means any of it will hurt them, that there will be divine protection for those who are preaching the true gospel. And it doesn't quite say here that everyone, I mean, I think it's speaking as a body of believers that will see these things happening. And some people will give the gift of healing. Some people have the gift of speaking in different tongues and languages. And some people, might be poisoned or bitten. Not everyone's going to be bit by a poisonous snake, but those who do, will be healed. And so we should be able to see these type of signs and miracles for those who have that faith. And we might want to wonder, why don't we see enough of it today? Well, let us also remember Malachi, I should say, Malachi chapter 3, verse 6. It says, "For I am," this is our Creator speaking, "I am," and it says the holy name here, the Yud He Vav He, the 4 letters there for his holy name. He says, "I do not change." He says he doesn't change. And then in the book of Hebrews 13:8, it says, Yeshua, Messiah, is the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. So he doesn't change. So we see a witness in both in the Tanakh, the Old Testament as most people refer to it, and also in the New, the Brit Hadashah. Therefore, what I propose to you, in order to see more of these signs and wonders, what I propose is let's complete a reformation, a restoration of the truth, and not try to fabricate stories or create commandments or traditions that are contrary or supposed to be equal or higher in authority than this, but that they are compliant, and that this has trumps anything that we can come up with in writing or in video. And don't just believe me either, but really put things to the test and prove all things. Let's restore all the true doctrines, the teachings that have become extinct. There's a lot of true ones out there that have been around and popular, but there's a lot of false stuff too that we need to get rid of and complete this Reformation. The Protestant reformers 500 years ago started a Reformation because of a lot of the bad things that were being taught and practiced within Catholicism, but they stopped short of completing it. And that's what I propose to you, is that let's continue. A lot of these Protestant movements have grown fast when they start coming out of bad teaching, bad doctrine, and bad practices, but then they stop. And they correct the errors, and then they stop correcting, and then they don't grow anymore after that. Let's continue and grow and restore what has been lost, what has been hidden, what has become almost extinct, as if we're in some kind of spiritual famine in the lands here. And that means we have to also break down the walls of prejudice. Prejudice that after centuries of hatred between the Jews and the Gentiles, between Judaism and Christianity even, and they've been polarizing over those bloody dark ages and centuries. After the 1st century CE, the polarization has continued, and so what we need to do is restore, reform, and repair what has been lost and stolen. As we see in the book of Jude, who is also known as the physical brother, not just spiritual brother of Yeshua, half-brother, same mother. It says, "Dear friends, I was," in Jude 3, chapter 1, verses 3 and 4. There's only one chapter, verses 3 and 4 in this book of Jude. He says, "Dear friends, I was busily at work writing to you about the salvation we share, when I found it necessary to write, urging you, here's some emotion and power here behind this, heart, to keep contending earnestly," another emotional, powerful word here, earnestly, for the faith which was once for all passed on to his people. Whether Jew or Gentile, if you are his people, let's return and go back and learn that this book is holy. It's one book. It doesn't contradict itself. If it does, we've been misinformed or it has been mistranslated. And look at the actual words, go back to the original languages, and let's find the unity of the faith. Not the diversity of the faith, but the unity of the faith here. Continuing on here in verse 4, for certain individuals, the ones written about long ago as being meant for this condemnation, and this is the Complete Jewish Bible translation, have wormed their way in, ungodly people who pervert his grace. Notice that grace can be perverted. It can become cheap, like some kind of greasy, loosey-goosey type grace where you don't have to change your lifestyles. You can be however you want to be. You know, you could say that he died and fulfilled it, so we don't have to. These kind of teachings that come out. He says, who turn grace into license for debauchery and disown our own Master and Lord, Yeshua, the Messiah. And so if we are believers in that, we don't want to do that. We want, hear Judah saying, return back to that teaching that was taught faithfully. As 2 Peter says at the end of his chapter, 2 Peter chapter 3 and verse 18, he says, but grow in the grace, not just grace alone or faith alone, but in the also the knowledge of our Lord and Savior, our Messiah. And I say Lord like Master, and Savior, the Son, his Son, and our Messiah. Grow in knowledge of him.